Are We Our Fictions? The Narrative Boundaries of Self. Written by Alsobrook, 2014. Read by Naomi Kirst-Schultz, 5/22/2022. I send to you these words. I send them as a way to reach you, reach inside you, and by so doing grant you access to what is happening with me, here in this moment. You, in turn, upon receiving my words, make space for them within yourself. Unpack them, examine them for significant reference, string them together based upon a received and established common referent, before in turn formulating your own words to send back as response. This exchange we have just performed most people would recognize as a simple act of communication, about which there are many theories and ideas that explore how and why this takes place. In this paper and for this argument, I am concerned with how this happens, and the various implications of this transactional and transferential act. I begin with an image of a Boshing Skull and exploded crania developed by the 19th century French anatomist Claude Boshing as a way to investigate the architecture of the human head. What is perhaps most striking about this image, though easy to overlook, is the relatively small space sheltered by the articulated pieces of bone that delimit a central void. However, this lacuna is where the entirety of our world exists. It is the seat of all the stories and activities we will ever know and experience. As a metaphor, this image is a device that carries with it much more than just a representation of the fantastic. It also carries a history, a meaning, and a story. As a deconstructed signifier for story, the Boshing Skull relates to narrative in a similar fashion. Narrative is the catalyzing agent that unpacks the constituent elements contained within such stories. Much like a hologram, narrative frees this information by extracting it, and by doing so allows its expansion to exist in narrative space. Indeed, narrative can be construed as holographic in nature because it creates the structure and form for the inert elements trapped within the confines of story. My intent is to explore this intercranial void. I will do so from a field of communication. Trained as a graphic designer, it is this realm, this mode of ingress that is most familiar to me. I'm interested in stories and their narrative form for the simple reason that a narrative is a fundamental component to the craft of graphic design. However, narratology is also a field of inquiry that I'm drawn to, particularly in regard to the interrogation of how and why stories are so important to us. As I excavate this space of inquiry, I will revisit concepts that facilitate my exploration, while being mindful that many of these foundational concepts emanated from other fields of study and have been consigned, restricted use, and/or are hotly debated amongst researchers in their particular disciplines. I will make use of these terms in much the same way that a Boshing Skull allows the viewer to have multiple, previously hidden ways of seeing. The use of these axiological concepts will allow for an exploration of familiar territory from alternate points of view. In setting the stage for this investigation, Lyotard posits that grand narrative is a summation of knowledge in the form of storytelling. Antecedent to this, Aristotle put forward diegesis and mimesis as both the telling and showing of stories respectively. I would like to add to this an additional analogy. Stories with memes as they relate to narrative, to consciousness. Stories are to memes as narrative is to consciousness. Utterance. The Russian semiotician and literary theorist Mikhail Bakhtin first suggested the idea of utterance in the dialogic imagination as a means to examine text within the confines of literary analysis. For Bakhtin, concerned solely with text ensconced within the novel, an utterance refutes, affirms, supplements, and relies upon the others, presupposes them to be known, and somehow takes them into account. Therefore, each kind of utterance is filled with various kinds of responsive reactions to other utterances of the given sphere of speech communication. As a part of speech communication, an utterance is defined as a grammatical unit in the form of a sentence. As such, a sentence is delimited by 4 properties identified by John Schotter in his analysis of Bakhtin as the The first, boundaries. Second, responsivity or dialogicality. Third, finalization. And fourth, generic form. From this delineation, we can gather that a sentence is a confined unit. Bakhtin positions this unit between moments of silence that acknowledge, add to, or disprove a communication objective. Additionally, a sentence as utterance is demarcated by a change in voice, implied in the reading, and the generic form it takes, Bakhtin's notion of genre. Bakhtin suggests that there exists an appropriate sphere within which such utterances take place, and through that placing, they make sense. It is interesting that genre, as further explained by Bakhtin, is neither form nor ideology, but rather a form-shaping ideology, a special kind of creative activity embodying a specific sense of experience. From Morson and Emerson, 1990. However, Bakhtin's theory of utterance, in conjunction with his postulations for genre, while enlightening, is too limiting, perhaps even debilitating given the degree of its confinement to textual analysis. I propose a broader view be taken, one that expands the notion of utterance to include concepts that move beyond the sentence. I contend that most forms of communication, from simple monosyllabic grunts, gestures, and speech, to the inclusion of all possible media formats extant today and in the foreseeable future, qualify as utterance. The justification for this inclusive gesture is straightforward. The only means possible for extending one's thoughts to another is predicated by some form of media transference, be it sound waves, visual cues, words, radio waves, images, movies, tweets, etc. All methods and means for producing the externalization of thought require some method of containment and conveyance. Memes. Further to this, and in order to establish a rationale for the reconsideration of utterance, I'd like to propose a revisitation of Richard Dawkins' memes found in his initial discussion of their existence from The Selfish Gene. For Dawkins, memes exist as cultural units of information analogous to the way that genes exist for the encoding of human DNA. In this analogy, memes are the replicating and propagating bodies of cultural information that define a culture by virtue of their use and transference amongst group members. Dawkins suggests that this evolutionary product was essential because it was beneficial to the species of man as a means to survival and as a determining factor in the continuance of human existence. Memes exist because we do, and vice versa. They proved to be economically beneficial as part of the human evolutionary process and therefore became a necessary part of our survival. In suggesting memes as a topic for consideration, I am aware of the debate concerning them and the somewhat contentious dissension surrounding memes within certain fields of research. For this reason, I'd like to take a moment to review the most salient arguments both for and against the concept of memes before embarking on a fresh analysis with regard to media and its relationship to communication and consciousness. In subtending Dawkins' initial idea, Susan Blackmore furthers the concept of memes as cultural units in her text, The Meme Machine, from 1999, by extending the notion of memes as something that makes humans special because of our ability to imitate. Indeed, she applauds our mimetic achievement by suggesting that memes are the singular device that makes humans special because they allow us to so effectively transfer instructions, information, and modifications to our behavior. In essence, memes facilitate our ability to imitate. Truly, we are so accomplished at this task that their continued use has allowed us to become the dominant species on the planet. In addressing this sociobiology of memes, Aaron Lynch forwarded a similar postulation in his work, Thought Contagion, by delineating the use of memes as both economic incentives of survival for the species and the social modifiers for the creation of cultures and the various group structures that exist therein. The existence of memes, it can be argued, facilitated man's evolution because they proved to be both beneficial to man's survival and a contributing factor to his overall development. Conversely, and to acknowledge the treacherous waters a discussion of memes can create, detractors of the theory of memes contend that their use in discourse does little more than muddy or dilute the intellectual waters because their discussion merely offers previous ideas in newfangled clothing, and thus is lacking a decisive definition. Equally dismissive, other critics of memes and mimetic inquiry feel that though it is an interesting concept, the discussion of memes borders on the pseudoscientific because there does not appear to be enough proven evidence that memes exist. Dennett, 1991. Consequently, in broaching a discussion concerning memes, I realize there exists an ongoing discourse both around their existence and the nature of their involvement in regard to human development. However, it is this involvement within human evolution that most intrigues me. The fact that the concept of memes has come to hold a place in this or any discourse demonstrates that something in their nature or use proves them fit for survival and further indagation. The definition of meme as a unit of culture is perhaps too simplistic or misleading given the reductionist tendency to attribute the idea of singular units of culture to explain the vast complexity it seeks to envelop. And while it may be possible to isolate memes as singular instances, I would like to provide a revised understanding of meme by suggesting that memes function as cultural units by virtue of their ability to catenate or cluster as successful strategic motivators of survival. From an evolutionary point of view, successful strategies of survival are not simple actions in isolation, but rather a string of actions that produce operative strategies for the continuance of survival. With continued use and proven success, memes guarantee that such strategies are rewarded with continual survival and consequently may be passed on to future generations. Memes and their ability to catenate are crucial in this process because as singular units and as complex formulations, they aid in the structure of culture and by extension assist with defining notions of self through their relation to story and narrative. For narrative to exist, elements of story are required. For these elements to take shape, there must exist the transference of thought from one individual to another. If we regard utterance in all its newfound finery as this method of transference, we may begin to apply an analytical framework to explore how communication and consciousness exist within a narrative paradigm. Story is to narrative as meme is to consciousness. In laying out the above for examination, a question worth addressing is why it is necessary to re-examine and evolve the concepts of utterance and meme. What do these two seemingly unrelated concepts have to do with each other, and how can an evolved understanding of these concepts allow for a more meaningful analysis of communication that is conscious of multimodal media as well as its transmedial and intermedial relevance? To begin, it is essential that memes be understood as stories, and that narrative is understood as a method for accessing the information within these stories. With this in mind, it can be inferred that stories are not just the traditional recounting of tales, but are in fact collections of pertinent objects and actions that encode various bits of information germane to that subject. Borrowing from the hologram analogy, stories alone are inert, an assemblage of elements that encapsulate certain activities, ideas, concepts, and so forth. They are the elements or ingredients within a recipe, but they are not the dish promised. Narrative, in contradistinction, is the activity of accessing the contents of story, freeing the elements into narrative space and placing them upon some form of chronological trajectory. Narrative is story in action, but it is also the construction and editorial execution that brings the contents of story into active dialogue. To extend the recipe analogy, narrative mirrors the making of the dish by bringing the elements of story into conjunction with time. In addition, narrative is the agent that enrobes story with cultural referents, that enact and engage the imitative degree necessary for codifying identity and promoting communication. I offer that as communication devices, memes, and utterance provide us new means of inquiry when regarded through the lens of the economic incentive of survival, I would argue that memes are stories, used and recounted by early humans as a way to maintain cohesion within the group, and as a way to increase chances for survival and expansion. In moving from trees to veldts and savannas, communication goals evolved and expanded to deal with larger data needs, thus spurring along an expansion of consciousness and the mimetic devices required to serve these demands. Indeed, regions of the brain grew commensurate with the demands placed upon them by the development of consciousness and the need for communication resources, especially between bonded pairs. Dunbar and Schultz, 2007. As such, all utterances, like the transference of memes, produced by our ancestors allowed for their continued survival because as a mechanism for our communication, they allowed them to coordinate and share their efforts for the betterment of each other and their group mates. Due to the considerable amount of time it has taken for proto-humans to develop, increasingly complex systems of communication developed alongside the enlargement of the brain and the expansion of consciousness. I would like to make an assertion that all media, as the variety of utterances they convey, serve as substrates for consciousness. This is to say, the encoded information and the formats used to convey information exist as examples of consciousness. For the purpose of this argument, let consciousness be defined in simplistic terms as the limited awareness of ourselves and others. In this light, utterances are both acknowledgments of this relationship and the means to enact and create connections between individuals. Although solutions to the hard and soft problems of consciousness cannot be found here, I hope to offer alternate models and modalities for the examination of this 3-pound universe we all carry with us. As a shared commodity, memes and by association stories emerged as a dominant form of communication for the insurance of survival. Additionally, these mimetic vessels created a catalog of experience that could be retrieved and stored in memories and histories as part of a shared cultural archive. In some ways, memes are concomitant with Jung's definition of archetypes, wherein cultural patterns or motifs reside in an unconscious state of existence, but can be detected as manifestations of behavior in the outside world. However, memes are by definition cultural units, while archetypes, as argued by Jung, belong to the realm of psychology as part of the human psyche. Memes, as discussed here, are specific to the individual cultures that create them. Expanding the notions of utterance will allow for the examination of differing models of communication and the types of media used to record them. Here, an utterance is directly linked to a meme as both cultural unit and the ability to transfer its significance to others outside the message sender. DeLuy, 1991. A meme is an utterance because it propagates and replicates aspects of culture necessary for that culture to assure its continuance. Thus, a broadened definition of utterance is any media substrate that grants access to new ways of seeing or experiencing the world. As a mimetic carrier, it is both a record of communication and a glimpse at constructs of consciousness. Because we have moved on from the biological constraints of necessity, we are now active participants in our own evolution. In probing memes based on their media format, perhaps we will come to a clearer understanding of what consciousness might be, while at the same time plumbing the depths of what communication might offer in terms of shared experience. With an increased ability to further our understanding of consciousness, we get closer to understanding certain facets of what consciousness means and how it operates. While it's doubtful that a complete understanding of consciousness can be fully achieved, studying the byproducts of its processes, the artifacts of communication created in the form of stories and narratives, could lead to new understandings about the self and self-awareness. In analyzing the mimetic devices couched within the stories we use to both describe ourselves and mirror those larger structures, we have received as part of a acculturation, we may obtain a better comprehension of how all these structures are interconnected. As our propensity for the development of new media formats expands, additional models for their discourse may need to be addressed or cultivated. Without the terminology or connecting framework to unpack these new mimetic forms, there exists the possibility that the boundaries and borders between these formats may become blurred or muddled. Bakhtin's original utterance offers a ready model for examining these formats, but requires an expansion of the idea in order to incorporate these propositions. With the technology to create augmented and virtual reality becoming more and more sophisticated and accessible, there should be tools in place to analyze and contextualize these new paradigms. As we begin to achieve greater understanding about available platforms for narrative delivery, there exists the real peril of falling behind in our ability to analyze, synthesize, and process the impacts of rapidly evolving and technologically driven narrative delivery. What may be needed are contemporaneous methods and evolved ideas about utterance and the meme for examination of media and future media formats, whatever form they may take. Accordingly, with the advent of ever more novel and inventive forms of media, each with various constraints and configurations, platforms such as Vine, Snapchat, Instagram, new models for the exploration of consciousness also become available. With each new utterance, these mimetic devices supply new ways for communication to flourish that mirror or engage larger structures within the culture that produces them. How does an evolved self, as part of this mechanism, contend with media and the narrative it constructs? As the opportunities for such samplings increase, insights into the nature of consciousness, culture, and the production of self become possible. As outlined above, perhaps in revisiting these stories as agents of mimetic utterance, the narrative provided with will model new modes of communication, and by extension, consciousness. Tangential to the proliferation of the modalities of communication, with increased access available and greater usage across boundaries of culture and subcultures, the constraints of language will be tested or expanded beyond previous capacities. Emoticons and Arabizi, the Latinization of Arabic, using the Western alphabet, are already beginning to provide a shorthand, a condensed version of language as visual nomenclature that is no longer tethered to a singular group of individuals, but instead is a shared commodity of thought. Indeed, just as evolution of brain size produced increased consciousness, ever-increasing modes of complex communication, stories and narrative as mimetic utterance position us as the driving force of our evolutionary ambition. We are now engaged in a more active partnership with our own evolution, less bondservant to biologically constrained principles and more masters of creating our own imperatives. We are poised to control our own advancement, and in so doing, the notions of culture and the individuals it produces will no longer be constrained by a singular language, but will partake in dialogues that promote different forms of understanding, if not alternative dialogues altogether. While narrative and narratology may not be in danger of disappearing from the canon of media discourse, it is important that the discipline of narratology be kept relevant when considering media, communication, consciousness, and the understanding of identity. Indeed, David Herman has already proposed the field of cognitive narratology as research on how the mind-narrative nexus that encompasses not only how stories can be used to build worlds, but also how such acts of narrative world-making are themselves mind-enabling and mind-extending. From Cognitive Narratology, 2013. By extending the discourse to accept the expanded terms of utterance and meme as proposed herein, the discipline of narratology benefits from a further infusion of ideas and concepts similar to those offered by Herman, but with a broader scope that encompasses media and other modes of communication. As substrates for consciousness and cognitive modeling, the expansion of how we define, understand, and discuss memes and utterances can vastly enhance the dialogue between disciplines concerned with communication, language, and narrative. Summation. I would like to end by re-examining the dramatic image of the Boshing Skull. As a signifying metaphor, this exploded articulation of bone is more than just a curiosity that encompasses a rather unremarkable space. This tiny expanse of emptiness is our home, our true home, for within this recess resides all the stories and narratives you or I will ever have or experience. In fact, the experiences produced here are the items we share as part of our desire, our need to connect with each other. This connecting of oneself to another was, and still is, crucial to humans because these connections establish our ability to communicate. As part of this ability and need to connect, we are able to transmit and receive cultural data in order to share resources that convey information about our shared experience in the past, present, and future tense.